Chapter 15. The Best Feeling in the World. Mourmelon, February 25th through April 2nd, 1945. On February 25th, the men of Easy Company had a unique experience for them, but commonplace for their fathers, riding through France on 40 and 8s, French railway boxcars that held either 40 men or 8 horses. It was the company's first train ride during the war, and it was properly appreciated. The weather was warm and sunny. The 40 and 8s were knee-deep in straw. There was plenty to eat, and no one shot at them. As we jolted through France, Webster wrote, swinging our feet out the door, waving to the farmers, and taking a pull on the schnapps bottle, I thought there was nothing like going away from the front. It was the best feeling in the world. They were returning to Mourmelon, but not to the barracks. This time they were billeted in large green 12-man wall tents, about a mile outside what Webster called the pathetically shabby garrison village of Mourmelon, abused by soldiers since Caesar's day, consisting of 6 bars, 2 whorehouses, and a small Red Cross club. In Webster's scathing judgment, Mourmelon was worse than Fayetteville, North Carolina. The first task was to get clean. There were showers, although the water was lukewarm at best. But for men who had not had a proper shower since leaving Mourmelon 10 weeks ago, the chance to soap and scrub and soap, lather, rinse, and repeat was pure joy. Then they got clean clothes and new Class A uniforms. But when they got to their barracks bags, left behind when the company went to Bastogne, their joy turned to fury. The rear echelon guards had opened the storage area to the 17th Airborne as that division moved into the Bulge, and the boys from the 17th had pillaged as if there were no tomorrow. Missing were jumpsuits, shirts, regimental insignia, jump boots, British airborne smocks, panels from Normandy and Holland, parachutes, Lugers, and other priceless souvenirs. The regime imposed by Major Winters added to their discontent. New recruits had come in, and to integrate them into the companies, Winters instituted a rigorous training program. It was like basic all over again, and hated. Webster was so fed up that I sometimes, in forgetful moments, wished to return to the relative freedom of combat. One of the recruits was Private Patrick S. O'Keefe. He had joined the Army when he was 17, gone through jump school, and shipped out from New York on the Queen Elizabeth in late January. I was sound asleep when we passed Ireland, O'Keefe recalled, which disappointed him as both his parents were born in County Kerry, the first landfall for cross-Atlantic traffic. He arrived at Mourmelon shortly after the company returned there. His first impression of the men was that they were all tough, old, and grizzled. I thought, "You have bitten off more than you can chew, O'Keefe." He was assigned to 1st Platoon under Lieutenant Foley and Sergeant Christensen. His 3rd night in Mourmelon, O'Keefe went out on a night problem, starting at midnight. Walking in the dark, in single file, he lost sight of the man in front of him and drew a sharp breath. He tensed, looked around. A quiet voice from behind said, "You're okay, son. Just kneel down and look up, and you can catch sight of them against the sky." O'Keefe did, saw them, muttered thanks, and moved on. Later he discovered that the advice had come from Major Winters. So here was Winters, his battalion staff cavorting in Paris, leading an all-night exercise for recruits. O'Keefe took the lead scout position just before dawn. At first light, there was to be a simulated attack against a fixed enemy position on the other side of an open field. O'Keefe got to the last ridge before the target. He signaled with his hand for the battalion to stop. He was nervous at the thought of an 18-year-old kid leading a group of combat-wise veterans. He signaled for the 2nd scout behind him to come forward, with the idea he would ask to trade places. Private Hickman came up with a rush, and before O'Keefe could say a word, blurted out, "Boy, am I glad you're up here. I only joined this outfit 3 weeks ago." Realizing the battalion was full of replacements, restored O'Keefe's gift of gab. "That's okay, kid," he said to Hickman. "I'm going over the ridge to see what's on the other side. You go back and be ready to pass my signal when I give it." In a couple of minutes, O'Keefe was back on the ridgeline, holding his rifle up with both hands as a signal, "Enemy in sight." Foley moved his platoon up to the starting line, shouting, "Lay down a field of fire," and the attack began. After a few minutes of blasting away, Joe Leapgott jumped up, gave an Indian war whoop, rushed toward the objective, and attacked the machine gun pit with his fixed bayonet, ripping open the sandbags, playing the hero. O'Keefe and the other replacements were mightily impressed. On March 8th, Colonel Sink got around to making permanent assignments to officers who had been serving in an active capacity for as long as 2 months. Lieutenant Colonel Strayer became Regimental XO, Major Winters became 2nd Battalion CO. There was some realignment as Major Matheson shifted from Regimental S4 to S3, replacing Captain Nixon, who went from Regimental S3 to S3 for 2nd Battalion. Lieutenant Welsh, recovered from his Christmas Eve wound, became 2nd Battalion S2. Captain Sobel replaced Matheson as Regimental S4. Nixon's demotion from regimental to battalion staff came about because of his drinking. Like everyone else who knew him, Sink recognized that Nixon was a genius, in addition to being a brave, common-sense soldier, but Sink an uninhibited drinker himself. Bourbon Bob was his behind-his-back nickname, could not put up with Nixon's nightly drunks. He asked Winters if Winters could handle Nixon. Winters was sure he could, as they were the closest of friends. Former Easy Company officers were by March occupying key positions in Regiment, S3 and S4, and Battalion. The CO of 1st Battalion was Lieutenant Colonel Hester. Winters was CO of 2nd Battalion, where the S2 and S3 were from Easy. One of their number, Matheson, eventually became a Major General and CO of the 101st Airborne in Vietnam. One is bound to say, one last time, that Captain Sobel must have been doing something right back in the summer of '42 at Toccoa. You could never prove it with Winters, whose feelings for Sobel never softened. Indeed, Sobel's return provided Winters with one of the most satisfactory moments of his life. Walking down the street at Mourmelon, Major Winters saw Captain Sobel coming from the opposite direction. Sobel saw Winters, dropped his head, and walked past without saluting. When he had gone a further step or two, Winters called out, "Captain Sobel, we salute the rank, not the man." "Yes, sir," Sobel answered as he snapped off a salute. Webster and Martin, standing nearby, were delighted. "I like to see officers pull rank on each other," Webster commented, "but not half so much as Winters." Winters had another pleasure at Mourmelon, this one on a daily basis. German POWs were working in the hospital. At dusk each evening, they would march back to their stockade. As they marched, they sang their marching songs. They sang and marched with pride and vigor, Winters wrote, and it was beautiful. By God, they were soldiers. The man who had replaced Sobel and Winters as CO of Easy, Captain Speirs, continued to impress both officers and enlisted men. Captain Speirs promises to be as good an officer as Winters, Webster thought. He realized that many disagreed with him, men who loathed Speirs on the grounds that he had killed one of his own men in Normandy, that he was bull-headed and suspicious, that he believed that there was no such thing as combat exhaustion. But to Webster, he was a brave man in combat. In fact, a wild man who had gotten his Silver Star, Bronze Star, and 3 Purple Hearts legitimately. Speirs swears by common sense, combat non-coms, and training with the emphasis on battle rather than the book. I like Speirs. There were shake-ups among the non-coms. Sergeant Talbot replaced Lieutenant Lipton as first sergeant. A genial man, Talbot was appreciated by the enlisted men because he ignored red tape and did things by common sense rather than the book. Carson became company clerk, Lutz became a platoon runner, the platoon sergeants, all original Toccoa privates, all wounded at least once, were Charles Grant, 2nd, Amos Taylor, 3rd, and Earl Hale, 1st. Hale's promotion caused some mumble in 1st Platoon. The men had nothing against him except that he was an outsider. He had been in Company HQ section as a radio man. The men of the platoon circulated a rumor to the effect that Hale had complained to Winters that his wife was after him to get another stripe, and Winters had given him the platoon as a result. What made the men of the platoon unhappy was the way Johnny Martin got passed over. "I guess the officers didn't like his flip attitude," Webster commented, "yet he was the quickest thinker, the best leader among us, and a natural for a platoon sergeant." Martin thought so too. Having survived 3 campaigns without a wound, he decided to let the medics know that he had a trick cartilage in his knee that incapacitated him for combat. He was soon on his way back to the States. The Toccoa men were thinning out like maple leaves in November, Webster wrote. A sense of hopelessness and exasperation filled the old men at Mourmelon. Here we were, still hiking over meadow and marsh, still trampling the rutabagas and breaking the fences, still in the field on training exercises. The veterans tried gold-bricking to get out of field exercises. They would report on sick call in the morning. Speirs would ask the trouble, grunt, and send them to the aid station. There they could get admitted to the hospital for a day of just lying around reading magazines. It was easy to pull. They all did it, but never more than twice. Even Webster preferred pretend war to reading or doing nothing. The Ides of March brought a well-deserved reward to the men of the 101st Airborne. There was a division parade before the most brass the men had ever seen. General Eisenhower was there, along with General Taylor, Lieutenant General Sir Frederick Morgan, Lieutenant General Louis Brereton, President Roosevelt's secretary Stephen Early, Major General Matthew Ridgway, and others. In preparation, everybody scrubbed and washed, polished and shined, disassembled, cleaned, and reassembled all weapons, as Lieutenant Foley recalled. Ribbons were dug up and positioned precisely on the blouse. The men painted their helmets, stenciled the insignia of the 506th on the side, and when they were dry, oiled them until they glistened in the sun. There was a practice parade in anticipation. Of course, the officers got the men on the parade ground 3 hours before Ike and his party arrived. Of course, the men cursed the army and its ways. Eisenhower finally arrived. He drove past the whole division, then climbed up on a reviewing stand to give a speech. He announced that the division had received a Presidential Distinguished Unit citation, the first time in the history of the Army that an entire division had been so cited, for its performance at Bastogne. In a short speech, Ike was effusive in his praise. You were given a marvelous opportunity in Bastogne, and you met every test. I am awfully proud of you. He concluded with a mixture of praise and exhortation. With this great honor goes also a certain responsibility. Just as you are the beginning of a new tradition, you must realize, each of you, that from now on the spotlight will beat on you with particular brilliance. Whenever you say you are a soldier of the 101st Division, everybody, whether it's on the street, in the city, or in the front line, will expect unusual conduct of you. I know that you will meet every test of the future like you met it at Bastogne. Webster, who was becoming ever more the cynic about the Army, and who was exercising vigorously the soldier's right to grouse, was impressed in spite of himself. Private O'Keefe commented, Even the new replacements like myself felt enormous pride in marching in that review. For Lieutenant Foley, there was the surprise to end all surprises. Standing behind General Taylor was his senior aide, none other than Captain Norman Dyke. Sergeant Hale, who had had his throat slashed in the Ardennes, and who had medical permission to go without a tie, had his Bronze Star presented to him by General Eisenhower. Ike wanted to know why he was not wearing a tie. Hale explained. When General Taylor confirmed Hale's story, Ike gave his big laugh and said Hale was the only man in the entire European theater of operations to pull this one off. There were furloughs and leaves to England, the Riviera, Paris, Brussels, and evening passes to Reims. Captain Speirs got to go to England, where he had married a British woman who believed her husband had been killed in North Africa. Foley got to Paris, and on return confessed he could not remember a thing. There were some USO shows, with big-name performers, including Marlene Dietrich. Garrison life was soft, but it had its price. To bring discipline and appearance up to a proper rear echelon standard, the Army had to have some method of enforcing rules and regulations. Threatening members of a rifle company that had just come off the line and was about to go back in with a visit to the stockade was less a threat than a promise. Taking hard cash out of the hands of men who were anticipating a pass to Paris, however, caught their attention. A private in the 101st received $50 per month base pay, a $50 bonus for hazardous duty, and an additional $10 for being in the combat zone. General Taylor set up a summary court in Mourmelon, and it began imposing heavy fines for violations. A man found in improper uniform was fined $5. Carrying a Luger in one's pocket cost $25. Speeding in a Jeep or truck cost $20. Disorderly conduct was a $25 offense. Training continued. It progressed through squad and platoon to company and then to battalion level. The division was preparing for a daylight airborne mission, Operation Eclipse, a drop on and around Berlin. No one was going to drop on Berlin until the Allied armies had gotten across the Rhine. For months, the men of Easy had been anticipating a jump on the far side of the river. But when it came, Easy did not participate. Eisenhower decided to give the 17th Airborne a chance at a combat jump and assigned it to Operation Varsity, the largest airborne operation of all time. The 17th plus the British 1st and 6th Airborne Divisions, and to save the 82nd and 101st for Berlin. Non-participation in Operation Varsity was a disappointment to many of the replacements who had gone through the rigors of jump school, joined the most famous airborne division in the world in Belgium or Germany, and never taken part in a combat jump. At Mourmelon, a unit of Troop Carrier Command made it possible for men who wished to do so to make a few jumps to qualify for their paratrooper bonus, or just for the fun of it. Lieutenant Foley made 2, but that wasn't like the real thing. So on March 24th, the members of E Company watched with mixed feelings as one C-47 after another roared down the runway at the nearby airfield, circled, formed up into a V of Vs, 9 abreast, and headed northeast. It was a beautiful sight, Foley recalled. It made your heart pump faster, and for a guy like me, having been integrated into a company that had been on 2 combat jumps, I did feel that I had missed the last opportunity. Some of the old soldiers felt the same way. To his amazement, Webster found himself wishing that he was jumping with the 17th. It would have been fun. Instead, he stood on the ground with his buddies, cheering, giving the V for victory sign, shouting, "Go get 'em, boys! Give 'em hell!" Then, Webster wrote, I watched them fade in the distance with a dull drone, and I suddenly felt lonely and abandoned, as though I had been left behind. One 506th man who was not left behind was Captain Nixon. General Taylor selected him to jump with the 17th as an observer for the 101st. Fortunately for Nixon, he was assigned to be jump master of his plane. The plane was hit. Only Nixon and 3 others made it out before it crashed. Nixon was attached to the 17th for only 1 night. On March 25th, he was sent back over the Rhine and flown by a special small plane to the 2nd Battalion in Mourmelon. The jump qualified Nixon to be one of 2 men in the 506th eligible to wear 3 stars on his jump wings: Normandy, Holland, and Operation Varsity. The other was Sergeant Wright of the Pathfinders, who had been in Easy Company back at Toccoa. German resistance to Operation Varsity was fierce. Meanwhile, infantry and armored divisions of the U.S. First Army were pouring across the Rhine via the recently captured Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, then swinging north to encircle the German army defending Germany's industrial heartland in the Ruhr. Eisenhower needed to bolster the ring around the Ruhr. The 82nd and 101st were available. The orders came at the end of March. The company was moving out, back to the front, this time on the Rhine River. The veterans resolved not to take any chances. The end of the war was in sight, and they now believed what they could not believe at Bastogne, that they were going to make it safe, more or less intact. They wanted to escape the boredom of garrison. They knew how to take care of themselves. They were ready to do their job, but not to be heroes. In contrast to the veterans, the replacements thought Mourmelon was a super place. They trained with veterans day and night in realistic problems, all under the watchful eye of a man who was a legend in E Company, Major Winters. They had learned life-saving lessons. They had gotten to know and be accepted by the veterans. They were proud to be in the company, the regiment, the division, and were eager to show that they were qualified to be there. So Easy was ready at the end of March, when orders came to prepare to move out. It would be by truck to the Rhine. Webster was delighted to be getting out of Mourmelon, apprehensive and excited about going back into combat, and disappointed that he was not jumping into battle. I had hoped to make another jump, he wrote, rather than ride to the front in trucks, for there is an element of chance in an airborne mission. It may be rough, it may be easy. Perhaps there will be no enemy at all. which appeals to me more than the prosaic infantry attack against an enemy who knows where you are and when you're coming. Private O'Keefe was about to enter combat for the first time. He has a vivid memory of the occasion. We wore light sweaters under field jackets, trousers bloused over combat boots, trench knife strapped on right leg, pistol belts with attached musette bags, one phosphorus grenade and one regular hand grenade taped onto our chest harness, canteens, first aid kit, K-rations stuffed into our pockets, steel helmet and rifle. We carried cloth bandoliers for our rifle clips in place of the old-fashioned cartridge belts. Our musette bags carried a minimum of shorts, socks, shaving gear, sewing kit, cigarettes, etc. After hearing Mass celebrated by Father John Maloney and receiving a general absolution, O'Keefe pulled himself into a truck and was off for Germany. Easy Company was about to enter its fifth country. The men had liked Britain and the English people enormously. They did not like the French, who seemed to them ungrateful, sullen, lazy, and dirty. They had a special relationship with the Belgians because of their intimate association with the civilians of Bastogne, who had done whatever they could to support the Americans. They loved the Dutch, brave, resourceful, overwhelmingly grateful, the best organized underground in Europe, cellars full of food hidden from the Germans but given to the Americans, clean, hard-working, honest, were only some of the compliments the men showered on the Dutch. Now they were going to meet the Germans. For the first time, they would be on front lines inside enemy territory, living with enemy civilians. And if the rumor proved true, the one that said instead of living in foxholes, they were going to be billeted in German houses, they would be getting to know the Germans in an intimate fashion. This would be especially true once the Ruhr pocket was eliminated and the advance across central Germany began. Then they would be staying in a different house every night, under conditions in which the occupants would have only a few minutes' notice of their arrival. They would be coming as conquerors, who had been told to distrust all Germans, and who had been forbidden by the non-fraternization policy to have any contact with German civilians. But except for Liebgott and a few others, they had no undying hatred of the Germans. Many of them admired the German soldiers they had fought. Webster was not alone in feeling that most of the atrocities they had heard about were propaganda. Anyway, they would soon see for themselves whether all the Germans were Nazis, and if the Nazis were as bad as the Allied press and radio said they were.